In the shadowed twilight of the late Bronze Age, around the year 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean world pulsed with the rhythm of the most sophisticated economies humanity had yet created. Towering palaces crowned with cedar beams overlooked bustling harbors where merchant galleys from Cyprus, Egypt, and the distant lands beyond the Black Sea unloaded cargoes of copper ingots, fragrant myrrh, and polished ivory tusks. The air hummed with the low chant of scribes, etching clay tablets in linear B and cuneiform, recording the precise weights of tin that would transform raw copper into the bronze blades and tools sustaining empires. Kings in Mycenaean, Hattusa, and Ugarit presided over vast redistribution systems, where grain from fertile plains fed artisans crafting luxury goods for royal tombs, while tribute from vassal states flowed inward like blood through veins. It seemed unbreakable, this web of trade routes stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates, binding distant cultures in mutual dependence. Yet beneath the golden glow of oil lamps in throne rooms and the distant crash of waves against stone quays, something stirred. The collapse did not announce itself with trumpets or marching armies. It began as a faint tremor in the earth, a whisper in the wind, across parched fields, invisible to those who still rose at dawn to tend their olive groves and bronze forges. No one understood what was coming next, for the prosperity felt eternal, as enduring as the mountains framing the horizon. For centuries, these ancient economies had evolved into intricate palace-centered systems, where every element served the central authority. Rulers controlled the production of bronze, the lifeblood of warfare and agriculture, by monopolizing the import of tin from far-flung mines in what is now Afghanistan, and copper from the rich veins of Cyprus. Scribes meticulously logged the arrival of ships, the allocation of rations to workers, and the storage of surplus grain in vast silos that could sustain cities through lean seasons. In the Hittite heartland, chariot workshops echoed with the ring of hammers shaping bronze fittings, while in the Levant, textile looms produced purple-dyed wool, prized across the known world. Daily life unfolded in a carefully orchestrated harmony. Farmers harvested barley under the relentless sun, their sickles glinting as they filled carts bound for palace granaries. Potters shaped clay vessels in shaded courtyards, their hands slick with slip. Merchants in crowded marketplaces bartered spices and slaves, their voices rising above the lowing of oxen. Children learned the rhythms of tribute and labor from their parents, while priests offered sacrifices to gods who, it was believed, guaranteed the endless flow of wealth. The scent of baking bread mingled with the acrid smoke of charcoal fires, and at night the stars wheeled above silent watchtowers, where sentinels scanned the sea for the sails of trading partners. This was the world before the fall, a time when complexity itself seemed a shield against misfortune, when the very interdependence that enriched every realm masked the fragility coiled at its core. Yet even in this golden age, the routines of daily existence carried subtle fractures that few noticed amid the clamor of markets and the steady beat of oars against the waves. In the Mycenaean citadels, warriors drilled with bronze spears, while their families stored oil in enormous pithoi jars, the clay cool and damp beneath their fingers. Artisans in Ugarit inscribed letters on wet tablets, sealing deals that spanned hundreds of miles of open water, their quills scratching with the quiet confidence of men who had never known true scarcity. Egyptian laborers hauled granite for temples under the watchful gaze of overseers, their backs glistening with sweat as the Nile's annual flood promised renewed fertility. The system rewarded loyalty and punished deviation. Taxes were paid in kind, labor was conscripted without question, and the palace bureaucracy tracked every sheaf of wheat with bureaucratic precision. Life felt predictable, anchored by the annual cycle of planting, harvest, and festival. The sound of children laughing in alleyways mixed with the low murmur of elders recounting tales of past victories, while the distant clang of metal from forges reassured everyone that bronze, the metal of power, would always be available. But these everyday rhythms, so deeply ingrained, blinded the inhabitants to the gathering shadows. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, in the small disruptions that seemed mere inconveniences, a delayed shipment here, a poorer harvest there, the faint creaking of an overstretched network that no one yet dared to question. The first invisible warning signs appeared like cracks in sun-baked clay, subtle and easily dismissed by those invested in continuity. Prolonged droughts gripped the Anatolian plateau, turning once verdant fields into dust that stung the eyes and coated the tongues of farmers as they scratched at hardened soil with wooden plows. In the Aegean, seismic tremors rattled palace walls, toppling storage jars and sending scribes scrambling to salvage their records. Yet these were attributed to the capricious will of the gods, rather than any systemic threat. Trade routes that had hummed for generations began to show delays. Tin caravans from the east arrived lighter than expected, forcing smiths to stretch their alloys thinner, the resulting bronze brittle and prone to snapping under strain. Overpopulation in some regions strained the palace granaries, while in others ambitious kings launched costly expeditions to secure distant resources, draining treasuries already stretched thin. Scribes noted the increasing reports of banditry along caravan paths, the occasional empty quay where a Cypriot ship should have docked, but these were logged as anomalies, not portents. The air in council chambers grew heavier with unspoken unease, yet the rituals continued, the sacrifices, the feasts, the meticulous tallies, because admitting vulnerability risked undermining the very authority that held the economies together. By the time the signs became clear to a handful of far-sighted officials, the momentum of decline had already begun its inexorable roll. As the decades wore on, rising tension coiled through the interconnected realms, like a serpent tightening its grip. Raids by mysterious groups later remembered as the Sea Peoples intensified along the coasts, their long ships slicing through the waves with oars that churned the water into foam, leaving behind burned villages and panicked messengers racing inland on exhausted horses. Internal rebellions simmered in overtaxed provinces where peasants, their families gaunt from meager rations, whispered of withholding grain from the palace collectors. Inequality sharpened, the air in council chambers grew heavier, but the rituals continued. By the time the signs became clear, the momentum of decline had already begun its inexorable roll. While kings hoarded gold and lapis lazuli in sealed vaults, the lower classes faced rising prices for the very bronze tools they needed to till the fields. Diplomatic correspondence preserved on clay tablets from Ugarit reveals kings pleading with one another for military aid, their words etched in haste as the usual flow of tribute slowed to a trickle. The once reliable trade in luxury goods faltered, leaving artisans idle and markets eerily quiet save for the occasional cry of a merchant hawking dwindling wares. Fear crept into daily conversations around communal ovens, where women kneaded dough with trembling hands and men scanned the horizon for sales that might bring either salvation or destruction. The palaces, once symbols of unassailable power, now echoed with the anxious footsteps of courtiers rushing between hurried meetings, their oil lamps flickering lower as resources grew scarce. Instability was no longer a distant rumor, it had become the uneasy companion of every ruler and subject alike. Key decisions, born of desperation and miscalculation, only accelerated the gathering storm. Hittite emperors diverted precious bronze and manpower into feudal campaigns against northern raiders, weakening their core territories and leaving supply lines undefended. Mycenaean kings, sensing the fragility of their thalassocracy, hoarded grain and imposed harsher labor demands on their subjects, sparking quiet resentment that eroded loyalty faster than any foreign blade could. Egyptian pharaohs, facing their own pressures from Libyan incursions, reduced support for Levantine vassals, severing the diplomatic threads that had once stabilized the entire network. Instead of adapting by diversifying resources or investing in local iron smelting experiments already emerging in remote forges, leaders doubled down on the old bronze-based order, believing that more tribute and more fortifications would restore the status quo. Messengers carried urgent pleas across the sea, their boats riding waves that now felt hostile, yet the responses were too slow, too fragmented. The rigid palace hierarchies, designed for control rather than flexibility, proved incapable of the rapid innovation required. Every choice that prioritized short-term survival over systemic resilience piled pressure upon pressure until the entire economic edifice groaned under the weight. The collapse did not strike like lightning. It was the cumulative result of decisions made in the dim light of failing lamps, where fear clouded judgment and tradition blinded foresight. Then came the moment when the system began to fail, not with a single cataclysm, but with a cascading series of ruptures that spread like fire through dry grass. In the harbor of Ugarit, Frantic letters scratched onto clay tablets described enemy ships on the horizon, their approach announced by the acrid smoke of burning warehouses and the screams of defenders cut down mid-sentence. Earthquakes toppled citadel walls in the Aegean, exposing storage vaults to looters who carried away what little remained. Trade routes snapped one by one as ports fell silent, the once constant arrival of galleys replaced by the eerie lapping of empty waves against ruined quays. Palaces that had stood for generations were put to the torch, their cedar beams crackling as flames consumed archives of economic records, leaving only ash where meticulous tallies had once ordered the world. The bronze economy, dependent on uninterrupted imports, ground to a halt. Forges went cold, tools rusted unused, and the specialized knowledge of alloying vanished with the artisans who fled or perished. Messengers who once carried tablets of alliance now rode through ghost towns, their horses' hooves echoing on deserted streets. By the time survivors understood the scale of the rupture, the intricate web that had sustained millions lay in tatters, its threads severed beyond repair. The ancient economies did not simply shrink, they imploded, leaving a vacuum where prosperity had reigned. In the wake of that rupture, human consequences unfolded with brutal clarity across the shattered landscapes. Famine stalked the countryside as granaries emptied and fields lay untended, their owners either dead or displaced. Refugees choked the roads, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage: clay figurines of household gods, a single bronze knife, the ashes of family members, while behind them rose pillars of smoke from sacked cities. Social hierarchies dissolved as former palace officials begged for bread alongside common laborers, their fine robes reduced to rags. Disease spread through crowded encampments where clean water became a memory, and the stench of unburied dead hung heavy in the air. The once proud warriors of Mycenaean turned to banditry, their bronze weapons now used to seize dwindling resources from weaker neighbors. Children who had once played among olive presses now scavenged for roots in the hills, their eyes hollow with hunger. The fear that had simmered for years erupted into open panic, silencing the songs that once accompanied harvest festivals and replacing them with the wail of mourners and the distant clash of desperate skirmishes. Entire populations migrated in search of stability that no longer existed, their footsteps carving new paths across a world stripped of its former abundance. Social breakdown completed the transformation, erasing centuries of accumulated knowledge and order in a generation. Writing systems that had documented the flow of wealth fell into disuse in many regions, leaving only oral traditions to preserve what had been lost. Law and authority fractured as local warlords carved out petty domains from the ruins of empires, their rule enforced by iron blades forged from scavenged materials rather than the regulated bronze of old. Markets that once thrived on exotic goods became ghost gatherings where barter replaced currency and trust evaporated like morning mist. The specialized crafts, glassmaking, ivory carving, advanced metallurgy, waned as master artisans died without apprentices, their secrets buried with them in unmarked graves. Silence descended over the great palaces, broken only by the wind whistling through collapsed roofs, and the occasional scuffle of looters searching for overlooked treasures. Families that had lived in the shadow of monumental walls now huddled in makeshift shelters of mud and thatch, telling stories of a time when the world had seemed invincible. The collapse had not merely destroyed wealth, it dismantled the very structures that had given meaning to daily existence, leaving survivors to navigate a harsher, simpler reality forged in isolation and scarcity. The long-term historical impact of this economic implosion reshaped the trajectory of human civilization in ways that echoed for centuries. The Bronze Age gave way to a darker interlude, often called the Greek Dark Ages, where population plummeted, long-distance trade nearly vanished, and monumental architecture became a distant memory. Yet from the ashes emerged new possibilities. Iron, once a rare curiosity, became the metal of everyday tools and weapons, democratizing technology that the old palace monopolies had restricted. Surviving pockets of knowledge in Egypt and the Levant preserved fragments of the old order, seeding the rise of classical civilizations that would eventually surpass their predecessors in scope and innovation. The interconnected economies of the late Bronze Age had proven both a source of unparalleled prosperity and a vulnerability of catastrophic scale. Their fall demonstrated how tightly woven networks could amplify both success and failure across continents. Ruined cities became layered tells for future archaeologists, their stratigraphy revealing the abrupt end of one era and the tentative beginnings of another. The lessons embedded in those layers, of overdependence, environmental stress, and institutional rigidity, would be forgotten and rediscovered by later empires, each believing themselves exempt from the fate that had befallen their ancient forebears. In the quiet ruins that still stand beneath Mediterranean skies, where wind sighs through fractured columns and lizards dart across sun-warmed stones, the collapse of ancient economies lingers as a haunting testament to fragility. What once thrived on the ceaseless movement of goods and the unyielding faith in centralized power now lies reduced to scattered sherds and half-buried foundations, silent witnesses to a world undone by the very forces that had sustained it. The palaces are gone, their scribes and kings reduced to names on weathered tablets, yet their story endures in the soil and the sea. It reminds us that even the most sophisticated systems, built on centuries of ingenuity and ambition, can unravel when the invisible threads of trust, resources, and environment begin to fray. The collapse did not end humanity, it simply cleared the stage for new chapters. But the emptiness it left behind echoes across time, a faint warning carried on the same winds that once filled the sails of countless merchant fleets. In that enduring silence, one can almost hear the question that haunted the survivors and still resonates today: how long before the next quiet tremor signals that another intricate world has reached its limit?